The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 1071 Exhausting. Before Lex could clarify the situation, Gerard came back, holding a picnic basket. It didn't matter, he'd said what he needed to say, and somewhat understood her situation. But just because she thought that her father, who was a Tao Lord, did not pay attention to her did not mean that was what the situation was. It still required some caution, but it was not like he was going to stop Gerard. After all, maybe this was a way for Tao Lord to build connections. Now that Lex had a better understanding of the power Tao Lords had, he knew that the distance between realms was no real gap to them, and it should be even more so when keeping track of their progeny. There was a chance that the Inn's destiny protection kept them from looking in on their kids, but considering that the system was barely functioning at the moment, that was hard to imagine. The dinner went nicely, and since they were all seated together, instead of only talking amongst themselves, Gerard and Lilith included the other two in the conversation as well. They were both so in sync that it felt like he and Cindy were being hosted by the couple. Afterwards, Gerard took out some smartphones from the picnic basket and gave everyone each. The phones were connected to the Midnight Inn's own portal, which was basically just like its own internet. As of right now there wasn't much on it, but at least they could communicate with each other as long as they were in the inn. With time, more and more features would be added to it. Lex eventually planned on spreading this across the entire realm without disclosing its origin, and eventually launching various services through it. He once read a novel about a universal internet of sorts that could do everything from teleportation to mail delivery to selling goods and services across the entire universe. He did not expect for his portal to reach the level of a fantasy novel, but it would be pretty cool if everyone started using it. It was actually quite straightforward. They brought him, through the shadow plane, to a spot in the actual Midnight Realm that was far away from where he actually entered. It looked like an island in the Chaos Sea, surrounded by the liquid that seemed to contain endless stars. But the island was fairly small, not even a mile across, and was completely bare. The only distinguishing feature of the entire island was a hole in the ground that looked particularly menacing. To pass the trial, all he had to do was go to the end of the hole, grab a pearl from one of the null clams, and bring it back. The fact that Lex could not specifically recall anything about this island or hole meant that it should not be too prominent. It didn't help that he had no idea where it was. But he went in. Of course, the hole was far from simple. It was not the dangerous monsters, traps, or pitfalls that gave Lex trouble though. It was how strangely space was behaving in the hole. The hole had many twists and turns, and branches that split off and went in different directions, so it was fairly obvious that most of it was dark. Lex's fairy dust was not exactly helpful either, since the darkness here was strange and oppressive, but only towards light. Every grain of fairy dust he produced seemed to be smothered by the darkness, fizzling out just as it was born. Lex himself remained unharmed, and if he really tried to produce light the darkness could not prevent it, but it did fight against the light. Since Lex didn't really need light to see, he continued on without it, as he got the sense that he was earning the hole's ire by summoning light on his own. But that's where the second issue came in. Moving in a straight line did not mean he actually traveled in a straight line, and there were times where he felt like he had been transported through space entirely, yet the hole always looked the same so he couldn't tell. It was becoming an issue, because only once the other Lex went to sleep did Fairy Lex realize he had been in this hole for days. Chapter 1072 New Abilities. Besides messing with his awareness of space, or perhaps moving him through space, it was also messing with his concept of time. He only felt like a few hours had passed, at most. Only when the strange feedback he got from being awake and asleep at the same time distracted him from his environment did he realize that, in fact, he had already spent days inside the hole. For others, Lex imagined that the difficulty of the hole would be the strange creatures that blended perfectly within the darkness, remaining completely undetected. It was a fair assumption, since they were also fairly powerful, almost reaching the golden core level, not to mention their fangs and claws all contained a powerful poison. But for himself they weren't even worth considering. The first time he encountered them he was surprised. He was not used to not being warned by his instincts, but his fairy body could not replicate them, He also wasn't so adept at fighting in this new body yet, nor did it have the incredible defense he normally boasted. But Lex had, after all, plenty of combat experience, and sword intent. After he cut down the first of the creatures, which would then dissolve back into the darkness as if they had no real bodies at all, he employed his glyph that gave him a powerful presence. Since then, any shadow creatures, as he named them, that he encountered would immediately reveal themselves and prostrate themselves before him. At that point, he couldn't even bring himself to use them as target practice. It was just as hard to hit a shadow creature worshipping you as it was to hit a smiling face. All he could do after that was explore the whole. Since there was no real time limit, he was not worried, but it wasn't like he wanted to spend all year here. After he paused, he came up with various methods he could use to try and overcome this hurdle, but there was one in particular that he was interested in trying. He cut out a platform for himself to sit on, and placed his glyph right above himself. Then he began to cultivate. Although fairies weren't supposed to have affinities, per se, he had discovered that fairies were really strange and defied common sense. He could not wrap his head around why that worked the way it did. Even with his spatial ability, his understanding of space was in its initial stages compared to the proper complexity of what space really constituted. The shadow plane made even less sense to him. But it was what it was. He didn't need to understand why it was happening to know that it was happening. Secondly, while his body did not gain any affinity, it did hard-code a specific affinity into his body which when activated resulted in an ability. Oddly enough, the ability had nothing to do with shadows, but instead granted him stealth. Both he and his fairy dust would become visible, and lose all aura and presence. Thirdly, the last ability he gained was to do with navigation. He would be able to channel laws related to the shadow plane, which meant that he wouldn't get lost in it at least. With his problem solved, Lex once again started traveling through the tunnels, this time without the glyph. He wanted to see if his stealth worked on the shadow creatures. Soon he returned to a portion of the tunnel containing the more malevolent darkness filled with nightmares that had taken to worshipping Lex, and it felt like home. He could see through not only the darkness, but the folds of the planes in the hole, and saw them as shortcuts if used correctly. He also remained completely undetected to all creatures. Even when he reached the end of the hole, and found the null clams, they did not respond to him. When he opened them up and grabbed their pearls, they only became confused, but did not realize someone had come in. 15 minutes later, Lex had made his way out. He had also thought of the perfect name for his second clone to go by, especially since he had a ship he planned on keeping with him. From now on, he would be. Chapter 1073. Nearly a month. There were only a few shadow talons outside the hole when Lex exited, and they were taken aback at the sight of him. Almost offended by how shocked you look, Lex joked. Let's head back, shall we? I have things I need to do, and I'm excited about the modifications to my ship. The shadow talons immediately escorted him back, and Lex was pleased to learn that although he still could not make sense of why everything was a shadow in this plane, he could navigate much more easily. When he was finally brought before the shadow talon who had promised him freedom from being chased, he too was surprised to find Lex back. Have you already succeeded? He asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Naturally, Lex said, producing the pearl. I hope with this you can finish the misunderstandings between us. I've been very patient, but if your people still keep bothering me then there will be problems. No, proud though we may be, the shadow talons honor tradition and legacy above all else. Since you have proven yourself, you are now a friend to all of us. Come, I will take you to the Monument of Recognition, where you can leave a trace of your aura as well as your name, for all shadow talons to see. Lex nodded. He was actually looking forward to announcing his new name. At first, he had thought of taking on the name Jack Eagle, after a very famous pirate from back on Earth. But Lex did not want anyone to accuse him of plagiarism. Besides, he was perfectly capable of coming up with a completely original, and in no way associated with anything on Earth. It was not like he had to make a reference with his name. So, he decided that since his clone was supposed to be low-key and hidden, he would go for a mundane name that would not attract any attention. That is why Lex felt pretty good about himself as he carved his name up on the monument of recognition, Jack Daniels. Yup, his completely original name that was in no way connected to anything from Earth, was meant to be a sign and an omen of how under the radar and low-key he planned on being with this identity. With such a common name, he did not expect to attract any attention whatsoever. Just calm waters from here on out. As it happens, began the elder Shadow Talo, we are throwing a celebratory party for a great victory we have won against our enemies. We would be honored if you join us, Jack Daniels. Please, just call me Jack, he said, feeling the name out. It was not so bad. He could really get used to it. There was something very grounding about being called Jack. It's been a while since I went to a party I didn't throw. This will be fun. Excellent. Ollie has been looking forward to seeing you again. I think he had developed a fondness for your ship. With everything going so well, Lex found no reason to delay his plans, and began to draw a map of Minara from memory, and began to pinpoint the location of the resin as best as he could. There was no point in waiting till the system completed repairs. He might as well have the next resin ready by then. There were about 4 more pieces of resin left on this continent, and all of them were extraordinarily far from him, so it would probably take much longer to find them as well. He jotted down all the relevant information he could recall, and once everything was ready, teleported away. His teleportation was a very useful tool, and obviously it could take him very far, but going long distances while trying to be precise was not easy. Over the next few days, Lex continued to explore the continent as he tried to find the location of the resin, and as a result, came in contact with more and more of the locals. They were pleasant, for the most part, if a bit large. He also eventually ran into the strawberries, which was not nearly as cute as he would have imagined. They were not red because of their natural color, but because they were bathing in the blood of their enemies. It was quite gruesome. They even attacked him, which got them nowhere. It would take more than a few fruits to harm him. But that confidence did not last him long, because soon after, he teleported himself in a lake of concentrated acid which did, in fact, harm him quite badly. Or at least it hurt his ego, because he once again became bald. Fortunately he had a contingency, which is that he learned a healing technique through which he could regrow hair. Besides that, he encountered a few volcanoes, though they were all dormant. He almost felt a little disappointed. Like that, the days went by, and eventually Lex encountered the region where the resin was. Although there was no sealed domain here, the resin remained protected as a result of another strange occurrence, which is that this entire portion of the continent had turned into a crystal that even Lex could not harm. It was green and purple in color, and everything from the trees to the grass to the dirt and rocks had turned into that crystal. Though, it needed to be mentioned that all the plant life was still alive, even in crystal form. Regardless, he could neither crack the crystal no matter how he struck it, nor could he travel through it as a soul. It presented him with a new challenge, and together with the help of Pell, he spent the next few weeks trying to solve it. It took him nearly an entire month before he found a way through. Chapter 1074 Not Possible. Absorbing the new system gave him a 1% boost, which brought the total system repair percentage to 29%. He was just 6% away from his goal, and with a little over 10 months left to somehow complete it. He was feeling good about his odds, but that would depend on how much the resin still contributed. The strange crystal had halted his tracks for a while, to the point where Lex even considered taking Jack Daniels' help. But when Jack asked the Shadow Talons if they knew about the crystal and could reach within it, they told him that while their plane encompassed the crystal as well, there was no way for them to exit the plane anywhere inside of it, not that they would want to anyway. The crystal was one of the 3 great disasters of Minara, since no one knew anything about it, and it continuously grew. Eventually there would come a time it could encompass the entire continent, or even more. It was a threat to all life. But fortunately, its rate of spread was slow, giving everyone time to come up with ideas of how to stop it. Even Pell himself was unable to identify the crystal, at least with the limited memories he had of his previous life. As useful as he was, Lex wasn't yet ready to enhance him even more, lest he encounter some unexpected trouble. If his time as a cultivator had taught him anything, it was that just because things were supposed to go a certain way, didn't mean they would definitely go that way. Thus it took him nearly a month to strengthen his domination to the level where he could use a glyph strong enough to let him pass through the crystal. The glyph was technically supposed to target precious stones like diamonds and rubies, but if this crystal fell into that category, who was he to argue? As long as it worked, he was happy. The resin was somewhere near the origin of the crystal, unsurprisingly, and Lex absorbed it promptly, this time without eliciting some major reaction from his body. In the meantime, since he was there, he went to investigate what was causing the crystal to grow. As it turned out, the source of everything was an egg. The egg was pretty small, only slightly larger than a chicken's, and had a tiny crack on it which was leaking a strange energy which was converting everything into that crystal. Lex felt intrigued, but did not touch the egg. His instincts were warning him it was not such a good idea, so he left. Now, he was off to find the remaining 3 pieces of resin. A few days after Lex left, Jack showed up on his ship, and after deploying the same glyph, traveled through the crystal and reached the egg. He did not try touching the egg either, but he flew over it, and began showering it in fairy dust that contained an affinity for laws relating to repairing. About a week later, the crack on the egg healed. At that point, Jack picked up the egg, put it on his ship, and left. That is how Captain Jack Daniels saved the continent of Minara, all without anyone finding out. For Lex, this week was spent looking for the other resin. It was not so easy to find either, and when he did, Lex faced another obstacle. This time, the reason the resin remained undiscovered was because it was within a region of Minara where the laws of reality were incomprehensibly different. Faced with this conundrum, Lex immediately returned to the Midnight Inn and locked himself in his meditation room. He had to carefully go over the endless sea of knowledge he had gained to look for other valuable items that may approach the resin in value. If he could find even one item, it would solve his problems. But he did not think it would be so simple. He was not sure how common Tao-level ingredients were, but he felt fortunate that there was even one in his realm. If he could not find something of equal value, he might start looking for something else of at least similar value. After all, it was not necessary that only Tao-level ingredients could help the system. Unwilling to waste any more time, Lex began to peruse his memories, and the days slowly passed him by, until another month passed. Only a little more than 9 months remained of his deadline. On one particular day, while Lex himself still had not come out, a group appeared on the horizon, visible from the walls surrounding the inn. At first their tiny outline remained undetected, but as they approached closer, someone finally spotted them. A number of figures were quickly approaching the inn, from the air. The workers on the wall naturally sent the information back, but themselves continued their patrol. An hour later, several large flying, leathery creatures could be seen, carrying a massive tube on their backs. The creatures soon arrived, and stopped near the town that had begun to develop on the border of the inn. From the tubes a number of other races began to descend, and the so far quiet town suddenly became crowded and rowdy. Activity could be seen even from the inn walls. A day passed, and at first it seemed like the new residents had just come to occupy the town. But eventually, they formed a caravan, and began to approach the gates on the boundary wall in a slow, ceremonial fashion. Great beasts of burden carried platforms in which many of the arriving caravan members sat, and drums beat to mark each step taken by the beasts. Other, smaller races danced and played music on the sides of the caravan, and birds dropped flower petals on the road ahead of them. With great fanfare the caravan approached the inn, and then stopped right at the gates, even though the doors were open. A particularly small creature, similar to an imp, climbed off one of the beasts and walked through the gate holding a large scroll, and approached the inn workers. Chapter 1075 Sir Kanye. Jace was on wall patrol duty, not that he minded. He was just glad he didn't need to use his earth abilities to build any more walls or forts. It was draining to an entirely other level, though to be fair, when his life was on the line, and so was everyone else's, exhaustion was a small price to pay for security. Still, he was savoring this opportunity to rest, and raise his cultivation at the same time. So while patrol duty might have sounded boring to anyone else, the contrast of doing patrol with the knowledge that something out there wasn't actively hunting him and everyone else made the experience much more enjoyable. The air was clear, the sunlight refreshing, the views great, the company even better. What more could a guy ask for? But even if he asked for nothing, he got a parade to look at, or at least, that's what he imagined a parade would look like. But it was obvious that their target was the inn, so Jace and the other workers positioned themselves near the gate. They would not exit the gate, but if the guests entered they would welcome them. Moreover, if they stopped at the boundary and just asked questions, they could answer. Although most of the inn settlements were far from the gate, there was a high-speed bullet train that had been installed here by the innkeeper before he left, to welcome any guests. In case they didn't fit in the train, there were other options as well. In the distance, behind them, a rumbling sound came. They were used to it. The massive spaceship which had suddenly come to life and gained a fear of heights was undergoing therapy not far from here. Just last week, the ship had actually managed to fly almost 50 feet, 15 meters, in the air before crashing down. Based on the sounds today, it still had not managed to return all the way to 50 feet yet. Jace's daydreams came to an abrupt halt when he realized that an imp walked through the gates of the inn while everyone else waited outside. The imp approached them and, after giving them a scan, locked his eyes with Jace. As if determining that Jace was the leader, the imp turned towards him and opened the scroll, blocking the view of half his body, and began reading. Kanye rolled up the scroll and gave Jace a haughty look. A figure of sufficient stature and station must come and welcome the emissary personally, or else it shall be treated as an affront. Owing to the emissary's magnanimity, as well as the short notice, he will wait no more than 8 hours. If, in such a time frame, a sufficiently qualified figure does not arrive, it will be treated as an official refusal to entertain us by the midnight inn. Without waiting for a response, the imp tucked the scroll under his arm and returned. Surprisingly, Jace actually felt great relief upon hearing Kanye's request. Soon, this group would be someone else's problem. Just as he was about to send someone to bring word to Gerard, he paused. From what he recalled, Gerard was on a date. In that case, he sent word to Luther. He was one of the highest-ranked members of the inn. Although, deep inside his heart, Jace could not help but admit he was looking forward to seeing the imp talk to Luther the way he had talked to him. He snickered, and then quickly used his new mobile phone to send Luther a text. This new midnight portal was great. Not only did it make communication easier, it even had a bunch of cool features. For example, he entered a group chat and started to share what he just encountered with a group of other inn workers, and they started a betting pool guessing how long it would take for Luther to beat up one of the guests. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 1076 Emissary. Luther was standing in the cockpit of the Silent Wanderer, looking at an active lava site. It was actually quite far from the main settlements, and was discovered by one of the groups exploring the inn's lands to better understand and map them. Once the AI running the Midnight Portal figures out how to launch satellites and keep them running and working in this environment, taking in consideration safety from any avian beasts, they would have a live map of the region. But until then, they would have to manually map everything out. This particular lava pit was contained within a mountain range, fed by several different underground lava channels as far as he could tell. The reasons he, in particular, had come to observe this place were quite simple. First of all, such a place would definitely help with his training of his fire abilities. Secondly, this looked like a particularly nice spot for a prison. Even the innkeeper had agreed to a prison, so now if he could just design one around this lava pit, or maybe even inside of it. The sound of his phone ringing woke Luther from his daydreams. He checked and was surprised at the notification. He was needed to welcome some guests? That had never happened before. Then he read Jace's explanation and took a deep breath, calming himself down preemptively. As unfortunate as it was, they'd all had some experience with difficult guests. Mark this area down as important and let's head to the gate, Luther said to Cirque. I'm needed there. The journey to the gate was swift, but it gave Luther just enough time to enter into the right mindset. The silent wanderer did not land, instead it just opened up a latch and allowed Luther to drop from the air, landing calmly atop the boundary wall, facing the caravan. Luther nodded, keeping his expression as neutral as he could. The Midnight Inn welcomes you, Pinafida. We have vast lands and many services we can offer, and all are welcome to them. If you follow me, I can lead you and your retinue to the main settlements where you can explore all the inn has to offer. Of course, if you wish to explore the inn on your own, you are free to do so, but in that case, I have to warn you that only the settlements and public transportation are truly safe. As for your wish to meet the innkeeper, it will temporarily have to be delayed. The innkeeper is occupied with some work, but the rest of the inn's workers are available to you should you need any help. The treant did not respond immediately, and it was hard to guess what it was thinking, since it literally had no facial expressions. Maybe an expert would be able to read the movements of its leaves to determine its moods or thoughts, but Luther was not counted among them. Very well. Let us first make headway towards these settlements you have mentioned, and get everyone housed. Then we can contemplate upon how to proceed. I take it that you have the authority to represent the Midnight Inn in all legal matters? As an emissary of the Tree of Heaven, I have come to discuss the terms to establish a fruitful and healthy cooperation between us. In the absence of the innkeeper, there is a council that can make decisions. But whether they will need to be disturbed remains to be seen. Let's move on, and then once I hear your requests, I can better judge how to proceed forward. The treant had been, this entire time, letting its aura passively leak, and it too was a golden core cultivator. In fact, it was quite strong among them within that realm, as far as Luther could tell. But how could he ever be intimidated by someone in the same realm, let alone by someone flammable? It was a joke. As for the Tree of Heaven, he did not take it seriously at all. Chapter 1077. What's that? The treant seemed slightly disgruntled that he would not be able to meet the innkeeper, but did not show it too overtly as it was used to doing. Luther was, admittedly, much stronger than Pinafida had anticipated. Few forces could boast golden core cultivators, and fewer still had golden cultivators who could actually match their might with those of the races living in the shadow of the Tree of Heaven. But then again, this much should be expected by a force which so boldly claimed itself to belong to the creator of the whole world. Now that was an absurd claim if Pinafida ever heard one. He would not be surprised if the Midnight Inn had even more golden core cultivators, and perhaps even a few nascent realm cultivators. That much was, at the very least, expected. One of the reasons Pinafida was here, besides creating ties, was to scout out the strength of this force. What would be done with that information was none of Pinafida's concern, as the higher-ups would be the ones to decide, but one could easily guess. After all, although the Tree of Life had given orders to make contact, it had not elaborated beyond that. Besides, the lands of Manara had long been ruled solely by the various races under the shadow of the tree. For an upstart to just appear and make such bold claims. Once again, it was none of Pinafida's business. But he could very well imagine that some might not take to it as kindly as others have. He watched as his servants unloaded his and his retinue's belongings, and transferred them to the train. It was an absurd notion to ride in some metal container rather than atop a mighty beast, but some places had strange cultures. It would suffice for the more mundane members of his escort, but not for him. Besides, he was too large to fit in it anyway. But Luther had a solution to that as well, as he summoned some of the local peacocks who had reached the foundation level. Upon request, they stopped suppressing the size of their bodies, and quickly grew large enough not only to carry Pinafida, but many others alongside him as well. That is Ming Jia, one of our guests at the Midnight Inn, Luther said. Although, most just commonly refer to him as the Mountain Man. That is a guest? Pinafida asked, shocked by the size of it. Although Manara housed many large species, such as the leopards, but even then they hardly reached the size of actual mountains. Before it could get over the shock of the guest, it sensed something else beneath it. The ground seemed to be moving on its own. No wait, it was not the ground. It was a vast metallic body that was just very close to the ground. What is that? It asked again, and pointed towards the ground. It's a ship. It flies through the air normally, but right now it's just hugging the ground, Luther answered, just as impassively. The ship, as Luther called it, was absolutely massive. It was hundreds of miles long and just as wide, and Pinafida could feel that it was extremely dangerous. Before the poor Treant could get over the shock he had already received, a massive pushchair being pulled by countless, beautiful undead with wings flew through the air. The baby Cthulhu was sucking on a pacifier as it looked around and tried to jump out of its chair whenever it saw something exciting. Behind it, Anita and Kawain were casually strolling through the air, a small hint of their aura surrounding the pushchair, keeping the baby in place lest it fall out. Pinafida tried to point once more, but the dread caused by the aura of immortals caused its brain to shut down momentarily, leaving him stuttering as he tried to comprehend a level of power their world could not technically support. What? He kept repeating, right up until the pushchair flew out of sight. Luther resisted the urge to scoff. Trees. The only things they were good for was bonfires. Chapter 1078 Quaint Charm. Those were just some of the inn-workers enjoying their holidays, Luther explained, anticipating the question Pinafida wanted to ask. Workers? They were workers, the Treant asked in disbelief. Although he himself was only in the Golden Core realm, he had spent a lot of time under the guidance of nascent-level beings, not to mention he had personally received the blessing of the Tree of Heaven when he came to life. He knew what their auras were like, and they were nothing compared to those two. Pinafida shuddered, and caught itself. It must not doubt the Tree of Heaven. That was absolute blasphemy. He was sure there was some kind of devilish trickery at play, fooling his senses. There was no realm above the nascent realm, because even the tree was only in that realm. This must be an elaborate ploy by the inn to fool him. It must. As soon as it gathered itself, the Treant saw a massive city made of glass, floating through the air. Is that our destination? He asked, looking at it with intrigue. No, that's just one of the spots guests can go and enjoy. If you wish to stop and take a look, we can. No need. I'm sure there will be plenty of time to explore the inn at my leisure once we have settled. Indeed, Luther said, and looked forward. Beneath them were the untouched lands of the inn that were relatively close to the settlements. They had been cleared of most dangerous beasts and animals, though there was still a chance of risk. Pinafida looked down with interest at the few guests who would show up from time to time. Since devils maintained their humanoid appearance most of the time, it was not so easy to differentiate them from humans from a distance, so the Treant did not feel at all impressed by most of the guests he saw. He was familiar with the human race. It was a defeated one, not worth his attention most of the time. Luther was different, though. Trants, he exclaimed in complete shock, but then he realized that no, they weren't Treants. They were actual trees that were alive. Before he could even consider asking Luther what that was about, a gust of wind rolled by and circled them a few times. You look busy, Luther, but whenever you're free, find me. I have a great idea, and I call it the hot air balloon. Together, we can make it work, said the gust of wind, before flying away quickly. Come back here, a voice called from a distance, and Luther turned to see a kaleidoscope of giant butterflies chasing the gust of wind angrily. Behind them, a single sky lantern was following, though it seemed extremely exhausted trying to keep up. Little Blue, who was not too strong but had developed an extremely intimidating aura since its wings grew, suddenly flew by as well, with little Fenrir riding on its back. They glanced at the Treant before continuing on their way. They had the same aura as. The Treant began to say, but could not. Although it had no lungs, technically, its voice was strained, as if it was wheezing. Before it could recover, they finally approached the village, one of the main inn settlements. It was filled with hustle and bustle, not to mention countless immortals who did not bother restraining their aura since the inn would protect everyone else from harm. The Treant, who was doing what Luther could not guess was a tree version of hyperventilating, was barely holding on at this point, but then it sensed the divine aura of the boulder shrine, and could take it no longer. It fainted, though that only made it look like a tree strapped onto the back of a flying peacock, which, admittedly, was a pretty normal sight for the midnight inn. "Quaint charm my arse," Luther muttered, as he guided the peacock down. Even if the recovery rooms were no longer working, he should show the treant to a doctor. Or wait, should he show it to a gardener? Chapter 1079 Inn's History. The arrival of a little over 1,000 new guests didn't go unnoticed, especially since everyone was quite interested in the inhabitants of the new realm. If someone said that all was perfectly well in the inn, then that wouldn't exactly be true. As months passed, many of the guests began to realize that they might be stuck in this realm for a very long time. Most did not mind, either because of their long lives or because the cultivation environment here was great, not to mention the opportunities of a newborn realm were unimaginable. A majority of the cultivators in the immortal realm who weren't in closed-door cultivation had already left the settlements to go explore the as-of-yet untouched lands of the inn. The same was true for most nascent soul and golden core, as well as a good number of foundation realm cultivators as well. Those who were not out exploring were taking advantage of the fact that the spirit energy here was exceptionally pure. If they had to pay to stay in the inn, they would never be able to stay this long, at least for the lower-leveled cultivators. So in a way, this was the ultimate opportunity for them to cultivate and grow their realm in a safe environment. But at the same time, there were many guests who were discontent as well. This was akin to kidnapping, and was keeping them away from commitments and people who they wished to meet. Disappearing without notice and being unable to even send back word was not something easy to come to terms with. These guests had many fights with the workers already, though they were only verbal fights so far. But there was nothing that could be done. There were also a few guests who did not mind taking all the benefits the inn offered, but had not a shred of gratitude in their hearts. In fact, they felt that everything they got was what they justly deserved, and had resorted to threatening the workers with what they would do many times if they weren't allowed to leave. Kennedy looked at the imp, then looked left and right. Seeing that they were alone, it would be a lie if he didn't say that he for a moment felt like putting the imp back in the donut and throwing it in the lazy river, but resisted the urge. "Ask not what the inn can do for you, but what you can do for the inn," he muttered to himself, before looking at the imp. "I am not one of the inn's workers, I am a guest here as well. I just helped you out because you looked like you needed it. If you're afraid of water, you should not have gotten on it to begin with." "Aha, a patron of the establishment," the imp exclaimed, then looked Kennedy up and down. "My good fellow, I am here as a patron myself, and am most curious about the history of this inn where we take refuge. Would you, perchance, have a moment to spare to enlighten me with anything you know? I assure you, the Treant Empire under the shadow of the Tree of Heaven will extend its gratitude to you for your cooperation." Kennedy was a shrewd crabman, and easily saw that the imp had ulterior motives, but it was not like the history of the inn was secret. His curiosity, however, was piqued by the sudden promise of intrigue. After all, since he couldn't go back home, he needed to distract himself with something. He might as well learn more about the countries outside the border of the inn. But while Kennedy saw through the poorly orchestrated subterfuge, not everyone was as simple to see through as the imp, and not all guests had the good of the inn at heart. Slowly the crowd started to mingle, and an unbelievable story of how the guests all saw the birth of the realm began to spread. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. By the time Lex exited his retreat, only 7 months remained to complete his quest. Considering that he had narrowed down a list of items that could possibly help the system and all he needed to do was go find them, that was both a very long and very short time. It was long because teleportation would cut his travel time down by a lot. At the same time, it was short because there was no guarantee that they would help the system. In the back of his mind, he had come up with a contingency plan, which is something he would only use in the worst-case scenario. It required the help of the rhinocentaurs who had access to the group chat. But, he didn't want to wait until the last possible minute to look for them. He decided that he would approach them first and get them to think of a way they could locate systems within the origin realm. Then he would just need to come up with a way to forcibly teleport from this realm back there, and then find the systems. It was an absolutely terrible plan with many problems that could occur, which is why he kept it as the very last resort. Ultimately, he had to at least consider that there may not be enough items that could repair the system in his own realm, although a part of him suspected that should not be the case. No matter what, the system had never given him a completely impossible quest. But at the same time, he could not scan every inch of this place that was 0.25 light-years large. "Mary, how are things in the inn?" Lex asked as he stepped out, feeling refreshed. Considering the monumental task ahead of him, Lex took the time to rest and recover to his peak state before coming out. After all, if he had spent so much time searching his memories, then a few hours spent recovering wouldn't matter. "There have been no major problems," she said, appearing in front of him in a suit. It was rare for her to look so serious, as she usually preferred cosplaying in more eccentric clothes. "There are a few minor issues that have cropped up, though. I think everyone at the inn can handle them for now if you want to focus on your quest first." T/his chapter is updated by. Perhaps it was time to meet some of the ambassadors himself. Lex summoned Fenrir, and sat on top of him, noticing that the pup's fur had become even softer since the last time they met. He had also begun to radiate a special kind of aura that was mostly suppressed by the inn. It reminded him of the mythical beings he met in the crystal realm, the primogenitors of the Frio and Soul birds. But Fenrir was definitely not a mythical being. The only thing he could think of was that its bloodline was displaying more of its prowess. After all, he did have a 100% pure bloodline. "Alright buddy, you remember what I said about scaring your prey? Well, now I'm going to teach you about intimidation. It's very useful when you don't want to actually kill your target, but you need them to behave." The pup turned and looked at him with a special gleam in his eyes. "No, it's not going to work on the turtle, so don't even think about it," Lex scoffed, and then put on his notorious anonymity mask, before teleporting them both away. They reappeared in front of the Midnight Manor, which was more crowded than it had been in a while, and everybody immediately turned to look at them. Both Fenrir and Lex gave off an aura that could not be ignored. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 1081 Beacon of Handsomeness. In actuality, Lex's mask, which contained divinity and was not a technique, was called the Invincible Tyrant Mask. The divinity it contained had a lot to do with intimidation and fear, since the divinity was born from the fear and worship the devils he faced felt. Compared to notorious anonymity, which just looked devilish and hid his identity, not only was it much stronger, but it also served the additional purpose of spreading fear on those around him, though he might not always want that. But at this moment, when his inn was filled with those who were so blatantly planning against it, he wanted exactly that. He knew that this wouldn't end until someone actually attacked the inn and were made an example of. That was the sad truth of things. But maybe the intimidation tactic could work, who knew? His target specifically were the locals. Although his guests who were upset at being forced to stay here were not exactly conducive to the environment he was trying to create, ultimately they were stuck here. Sure, they had gained many benefits, but they were also paying for it by being forced to stay here. If he was not able to fix the system in time, who knew if they would ever be able to return? So although they were annoying, he sympathized with them. Yet when he and Fenrir appeared, everyone looked towards them. Although their auras could not harm anyone, since the system would prevent that, it was rare for someone inside the inn to have such a threatening and dangerous aura. The older guests just felt a touch of curiosity. They knew they were safe, not to mention they recognized Fenrir immediately. The newer guests, though, the ones who had accompanied the ambassadors or had come with various envoys, they all felt absolute dread. They felt like death had become incarnate in front of their eyes, and revealed itself before them. It was the face of all their nightmares, and it had the power that should belong only to deities. It was also right in front of them. While many, including the workers, recognized Fenrir, very few recognized Lex's mask. Only the few workers who had seen him training in the temple knew that it was actually Lex underneath. Of course, he was using an illusion to make his body seem larger as well. Nobody exactly found babies intimidating, unless it was 3 a.m. and it was the baby's parents who suddenly smelled something funny. Lex observed the countless faces looking at him, and was easily able to pick out the new faces, not only just because they were from many unfamiliar races, but because he knew all the old guests by heart. A strange tension began to build in the air, as no one knew the purpose of his mystery masked man, and his aura did not exactly foretell a friendly visit. Finally, Lex's vision locked onto a particularly large black bear who was radiating an aura at the Golden Core realm. Strangely enough, he looked exactly like a normal bear from Earth, if a bit larger. There were no strange fangs or horns or wings, but as an apex predator in its given form, it didn't need them. As if to prove that exact point, the bear was one of the few who looked at Lex without being intimidated by him. "I'm going for the sights, Professor Oak, the sights. I've heard good things. I've also heard you have frequent monsters attacking from the sea itself. I've never seen a living being that can exist in the Chaos Sea. I'm quite interested." Before Oak could respond, someone else spoke in. "The Knot-Knit Islands are very conservative. You're not exactly going to be welcome there. Not everyone is like the inn, excepting anyone who happens to pass by," said a spider that was about 3 feet large. Lex frowned, and was very evident of his displeasure at the comment. The spider had just insinuated that the inn had no standards and would pick up every stray that came along. The room suddenly seemed to turn darker, though the inn protected the spider from feeling any kind of threat or danger from Lex's aura. No, the islands are very friendly, Mr. Tyrant." Oak suddenly insisted. "They're very friendly indeed. You just well, I hope you don't mind. I mean, if you want to take in the sights and explore the culture, maybe you could, if you really want, and had the time." "It's fine, Professor Oak. You can tell me. I'm a friendly guy. I obey the rules. If the islands have some rules, I will follow them. Isn't that why I'm asking you about them? Well, like you said, there are monsters that come from the seas, and some people have actually tamed those monsters. 8 island leaders, to be exact. If you go and have a friendly fight, a very friendly fight, Mr. Tyrant, nobody needs to die, then you can get badges if you win. Once you get all 8 badges, all the islands will open to you, and you will be welcomed like a native." "Really? The monsters have been tamed?" "How interested," Lex saying, then paused to look at the spider. "I wonder how exactly they were tamed. Did they beat them up till they fainted first?" He maintained eye contact with all of the spider's eyes while he spoke, and his meaning was quite clear to everyone. Just as Lex was about to continue, Gerard and Lilith walked into the room, hand in hand, talking to each other, completely oblivious of their surroundings. The carefully orchestrated, high-tension mood Lex had created was instantly destroyed by the giggles of a devil as Gerard, a beacon of handsomeness, flirted with her. Lex sighed. Chapter 1082 Treasure Hunt. Gerard and Lilith did not even know how they thoroughly destroyed the carefully orchestrated tension Lex and built up. They only had eyes for each other. They walked over to the grand piano sitting in the corner of the room, and Gerard made himself comfortable, and began showing Lilith how to play. Considering her cultivation level, she was a quick learner, and in only moments there was a soft, romantic duet being played in the var. Lex sighed, though Oak mistook his expression as irritation. "Mr. Tyrant, that's Mr. Gerard, one of your colleagues. Please excuse him, he surely did not mean to bother you." Lex raised an eyebrow. This Professor Oak was very averse to confrontation, wasn't he? He was trying to stop Lex from getting into fights at every turn. "Do not worry, Professor. I am naturally familiar with Gerard. I was just sighing at how relaxed he is. It is good that he is enjoying himself. After all, that's what the inn is for. Also, you may have some misconceptions about me. I am not going to the Knot-Knit Islands to fight anyone, and even if I do, it's not like I'm going to go about randomly killing people. I'm a nice guy, really. Okay, sure, I sometimes have to be a little rough, but that's only against people who harm the inn in some way first. Other than that, I'm very friendly. Honest. I've only destroyed 1 planet. You see how I hold myself back?" Lex wondered if he could really take credit for the destruction of the planet where the Midnight Battalion had been trapped. Technically speaking, it had nothing to do with him. The space around them just spontaneously tore. But it was not like anyone would come to dispute him. For the locals of the Midnight Realm, the statement of him destroying just one world was abstract, but for the older guests it definitely wasn't. They eyed him, though covertly, as they didn't want to get caught. Haha, of course, Mr. Tyrant. You're a very friendly guy. I believe you. We're having drinks, aren't we? We're friends. So in that case, would you mind sharing why you want to go to the islands? Maybe I can guide you so that you might not even need to fight the 8 island leaders. Truth be told, I'm searching for a treasure. I've heard that there's a really valuable treasure on the islands, so I want to try my luck at it. Suddenly, a large number of people in the bar turned to look at him, and their expressions were very serious. Many quickly looked away, considering Lex's aura was not weak at all, but many still continued to look. I feel like there's a story here, Lex said slowly, as he looked around. Gerard and Lily were literally the only ones who hadn't noticed the sudden return of the tension in the room. They just kept playing music that definitely did not suit the mood. Maybe they couldn't find it. Where did you hear about this treasure? One of the bar's patrons asked. It was a treant, though it looked significantly different from Pinafida. Oh, here and there. Why are you so surprised? It seems like everyone knows about it. Did you get a clue from somewhere? Asked the treant again, this time standing up and walking up to Lex. Maybe. What's it to you? Lex asked, not bothering to suppress his smile since he was wearing a mask. He was hoping for a volunteer he could beat a volunteer he could spar with so that the rest understood not to mess with the inn. It would serve as a small deterrent, until a big one was needed. The Tree of Heaven has sent 7 expeditions after the Chaos Crystal. If it were not real, they would not have happened, the treant said, finally reaching Lex, his figure towering above him. If you have a clue, you will submit it to the Treant Empire now, in service of the Tree of Heaven's needs. Wow, that almost sounded like an order, Lex said before taking another sip. It was remarkable how the mask did not stop the glass from passing through, but would stop anything else. Very multifunctional. All living beings are subject to the will of the tree, the treant said, as if that explained everything. Ah, so it was an order, he said, as he stood up. You want to take this outside? I find that I talk much better on a sparring platform. Lex didn't bother waiting, and walked out of the manor. For whatever reason, wherever there were cultivators, there were fights, so even close to the manor there were a few stages and platforms built where guests could spar one another without breaking the rules. Of course, both participants had to accept and the spar had to be monitored by a worker, but they were still popular. Lex walked up to one such platform, then turned to look at the treant who was following. In fact, it seemed like the whole bar, excluding 2 certain individuals, had followed them. Why don't you convince me to share the hint with you, Lex said, as he crossed his arms and stood there. I guarantee this is going to be your last chance, because after this, there won't be any more treasure hunts. I'll definitely find the crystal. It's a sad tradition to end, but it can't be helped. The treant, instead of responding, directly attacked, revealing his cultivation level at the peak of the golden core. Lex did not bother moving, and instead started to plan out his next set of actions. After the crystal, he would go visit the other 2 continents. They were much larger, and contained more treasures for him to find. Hopefully, they would be useful. Chapter 1083 Sapling. Everyone watched as the treant attacked with all his might, with clear intention to do as much harm as possible. Yet the masked tyrant remained unmoved the entire time. No matter how he attacked, or what move he used, it made no difference. The treant went from feeling severe wrath and anger, to surprise, caution, and slowly, hopelessness. Everyone could tell that the man had already started to daydream amidst the attacks because he would sometimes mutter to himself, and other times move his hands as if he was doing something. But the less he paid attention to the treant's attacks, the more dreadful he seemed. After a few minutes, he finally stopped daydreaming, and looked at the treant who was mid-attack. Enough, he said, and the oneness off the stage did not feel anything, but the treant felt as if he had experienced the command of an unparalleled being. He lost control of his body as it froze in its stance. Even his attack stopped mid-air, unmoving under his command. Lex, for one, hadn't done anything particular. He had not used any glyphs, nor did he use domination. Instead, it was as if, under the control of his mask, he could naturally imbue bits of everything with his voice, giving it power. The treant only heard his word, but Lex was able to see his words vibrated a strange way, forming a strange symbol. He just discovered another character that could be used in his arrays. Moreover, this character somehow seemed much more powerful than all the other characters he ever used. It was as if the meaning within this character was deeper, and more nuanced. Kneel, and for the next 10 days, remain kneeling, Lex said, somehow knowing that his words were enough to command the treant. It was actually a little scary to think about, since he was beginning to realize how weak he had been up until now. It would have been so easy for someone stronger to crush him. A word alone would have been enough to end his life. He planted the seed in the soil, and watered it with its own blood, to the point where he fell to his knees. Yet he did not stop, until a small sapling sprouted. Pinafida was weakened, but still determined. He planted his own roots in the ground right there, and manipulated them so that they touched the roots on the new sapling. Forgive me for invoking the seed before schedule, O heavenly tree. The situation here is more dire than we assumed. I have discovered two beings. Forgive my blasphemy, but I have discovered two beings who share an aura similar to yours, and many whose power is beyond my understanding. Today, finally, I heard from the mouth of one of the inns that he is beholden to none save the Innkeeper, not even you. They are planting the roots of rebellion. Please, go through my memories, so you know the truth of what I say. The roots of the sapling began to wrap around Pinafida's own, and then began to feed off of the treant's life force. Slowly, the treant turned from a sentient tree, to a dead one. That is when the sapling moved, and entered the treant's body, slowly changing it. A few moments later, it seemed like Pinafida came back to life, but found its form inconvenient. The wood that made up its body began to morph and shrink, until the treant became much smaller, and humanoid. Its eyes began to glow in an eerie yellow, and the vegetation around him began to die. The Innkeeper is busy, the treant said, then turned back to the inn, and jumped up over the wall. As it continued to walk through the inn, returning to the settlements, it began to drop more acorns along the way. The acorns seemed to contain a magical ability, and buried themselves in the dirt. Nothing else happened for now, but the surrounding vegetation seemed to lose a bit of their vibrancy, but it was too minor a change to notice. If Lex had the host attire he might have caught on, but he neither had the suit, nor was he in the inn. In fact, he had already made his way to the islands. Chapter 1084 No Time for Adventures. Exploring the Midnight Realm was a lot of fun, and offered many new adventures and experiences, so it was a little sad that Lex had to forego them. When he reached the Knot-Knit Islands he saw countless communities and various interesting races. The islands seemed to be mainly occupied by beasts and sentient plants who learned how to move around. They formed an interesting dynamic between them, which resulted in a rich history and diverse culture, not to mention some strange customs. T/his chapter is updated by. Lex wanted nothing more than to jump in between them, get to know the locals, have a run-in with the territory's bullies, and slap a few faces. Even challenging the island leaders seemed like an interesting experience, as they somehow managed to capture and train monsters that could live in the Chaos Sea. But he did not have time for any of that. He immediately turned on his treasure-hunting glyph, jumped through the hole that led to the underground continent that was much larger than any of the 3 continents above ground, and began to search for the crystal. He eventually discovered the reason it could not be found was because the crystal was held as a holy item by a secret race that had been hiding in the so-called underworld for a long time, and had abilities that could manipulate memories and cast illusions. Many thousands of years ago their ancestors had made a promise to a young monster trainer to forever keep the crystal safe. Lex really felt like he was missing out a lot, like he was playing a video game without watching the cutscenes, something he'd never done. But he just didn't have time. Eventually, he found the crystal, took it, and was pleasantly surprised to find that the system could absorb it, though it was only a heavenly immortal level ingredient. With that done, he said farewell to all the mysteries of this place, and promised to come back when he had time, but deep inside he knew it was unlikely. It was like promising to replay a game he enjoyed a lot, with the aspiration to play in a different style and unlock a different story tree. The idea was there, but for whatever reason, he never came back to those games. This is the third battlefield we've found like this. So much open warfare is uncommon. If we want to pursue answers, we should look for the associated countries. But why is it that every battlefield is near a Baratheon gold mine? This is too much of a coincidence. Not to mention, whenever we go to the mine, it's been stripped clean. I mean, Baratheon gold is not supposed to be so valuable. I know no use of it that other metals can't do better. Any time that metal is even produced, it's because the ore happens to be alongside ores for other, more valuable metal ores. So you think whoever is targeting the mines is after the other ores? It will need investigation to be sure. Shall I request an investigation? No, I can't rely on the talents for everything. We must investigate this ourselves. Let's see if we can find someone living on this accursed battlefield. They might have answers. But there was no one alive. Eventually, Jack was able to locate one of the countries at war, and discovered that it was a country of mutated insects who had become much larger. They'd also moved towards a unified colony, where various insects shared one single colony that supported all of them. Using his newfound stealth abilities, Jack began to investigate the country. He was totally not doing this because his main body was missing out on adventures. That is when he accidentally discovered, for the first time, signs of a deity in the Midnight Realm. Chapter 1085 Anxiety. Jack found a corpse. Or, to be more specific, he found the remains of a ravaged corpse, radiating a divine aura. It looked mostly like the exoskeleton, but there were enough leftover bits of the rest of its body to conclude that this was not the result of molting, but rather what was left of a deity after facing defeat, and possibly having been devoured by another. The length of it suggested that its original shape was very similar to the centipedal monster Lex had faced. The corpse was in an underground excavation site that was heavily restricted, and guarded by some of the most powerful insects in the colony. Lex could tell by the scurrying insects that surrounded the corpse that they had been studying it, and possibly been trying to make use of it to enhance themselves. The overpowered, evil creatures that formed as a result were probably failed experiments. Or maybe even successful experiments, based on what the objective was. Jack was not too concerned with the evil experiments of a nation of insects, though Ollie was properly terrified. No, Jack was instead more interested in what exactly ate this deity to begin with. He still had to be careful, as he was not as adept at using this body and its specialties, but eventually he made his way to the corpse and tried to see if he could find any clues. But whether it was through checking the corpse manually or using various techniques, it yielded no results. It was as if all clues had been specifically wiped by the culprit. Regardless, it was an interesting find. Lex had no idea that deities had already been born in this realm, since technically speaking mythical beings didn't necessarily have to be deities. They were just extremely powerful, and that usually resulted in them being worshipped. Eventually they moved on, since Jack was in search of ores. Ollie did insist on returning to the Shadow Plane briefly to report what it found, but it did not delay them long. Back at the Midnight Inn, the Tree of Life, which had inhabited Pinophatus' corpse, was suddenly faced with an unexpected prompt. It was told to pay for its stay if it wanted to stay longer by its personally assigned AI projection. It had not been expecting this since no one had been able to detect anything amiss with Pinophida, besides the change in appearance. But that hardly mattered. Its aura remained identical, and so did its behavior. There was no external indication that anything was amiss at all, yet the inn knew that it hadn't paid to stay. Technically speaking, Pinophida had paid for a very long stay, so no one should have asked him to pay again. Yet now it was happening. From the day it was born, the tree had never paid for anything other than through its desire for it to be accomplished. Its will was currency enough. But the inn required a more tangible form of payment, causing it to have to pay up for the first time in its long life. Despite how mundane the incident was, it only served to further nurture the discontent the tree was beginning to feel towards the inn. But it would not act yet. No, first, it would prepare thoroughly, and when it acted, the inn would have no chance to respond. Lex, meanwhile, was still blindly teleporting towards the other continents. Surprisingly, finding the gigantic masses of land was considerably difficult. The celestial ingredient contributed 1%, and the heavenly ingredient contributed 0.5%, bringing the total up to 32.2%. Lex felt a level of excitement at being so close, but at the same time, he could feel an anxiety growing. No matter how he searched, he could not find more ingredients, even when he went through almost all the items he listed on Nether. There were still more, but he had already checked the most probable ones, so he could not help but feel like looking for Jabalia. Since he had found Nether once, teleporting back to it would be easy, so he then began his journey to find the final continent. This time, he planned it better and made sure he was teleporting in the correct direction as he set off from Nether, which is why it only took him 2 days to reach it. Theoretically speaking, all he had to do was teleport to it, so it shouldn't have taken much time. But he was always afraid of teleporting too far and somehow skipping the continent entirely, which is why he had to settle for relatively smaller distances between each teleportation. But that was the end of the good news for a long time. Once Lex found Jabalia, he began to search for ingredients, but 2 more months passed by, and yet he could not find a single one. The anxiety he was feeling in his heart began to increase as he wondered if he should return to the inn and ask the rhinocentaurs if they had found any systems. But that was a bad plan, and even he knew it. The small celestial ingredient he found as a blade of grass gave him hope of encountering more ingredients, but how could he find something he had no way of tracking? Back at the Midnight Inn, while Lex was desperately looking for ingredients, a strange tension had begun to build in the air. None of the workers, or even the old guests, could identify why it was there, but the source was clear. The new guests became more and more silent as the days went by, and began to avoid contact with the workers altogether. Many of them even left the inn, which was completely normal, save for the fact that they left as if they were escaping some kind of calamity. Gerard, though love-stricken, was not so blind as to ignore such a change, and so ordered all the guards to begin searching the inn in case there was some conspiracy afoot. But they found nothing. Even so, Luther stopped his training in the lava pits he had nearly turned into his home, and the others raised their guards as well. Even if no one said it, they could tell that something significant was about to happen. Then, one day, without warning, the ground erupted. Chapter 1086 Currency of its Will. Long ago, when Lex was concerned about the safety of his inn, he added something called delinquent vines underneath the inn. They extended throughout the length of the inn, at that time, and could be remotely controlled to react to any incident happening at any time, anywhere. Later, the remnant soul of one of Lex's old tenants who had actually died, fused with the vines, which is how young MacDonald came to be. He had since worked diligently for the inn, though these days he had less to do with security than managing the underground of the inn. Some guests preferred to burrow underground, but then catering to them was not exactly convenient, which is where he came in. Though, as the inn grew, so did young MacDonald, which is why he was not exactly weak. That is why, when suddenly, hundreds of vines burst from the ground, screaming in agony, it actually came as a surprise to many. But what followed that was even worse. Massive, woody roots burst from the ground like pillars rising from the sky, ripping the vines to shreds in many places. Dirt, rock, and torn vines rained from the sky as a result of the numerous explosions, but young MacDonald was far from the only one who was injured. Most old guests, by now at least, were strong enough to at least survive the initial attack, but the children weren't. Jimmy, the serving captain of the Peacock Warriors, did not quite understand what was happening. Something had hit him on the head, and he blacked out for a few seconds. When he recovered, his body felt oddly weightless, and there seemed to be a pleasant breeze. But the world seemed red. He rubbed his eyes and that didn't make the color go away, but when he looked at his hand he saw blood, as well as a broken tooth. At the same time, as if through perfect coordination, the new guests, who had come as a part of various delegations, all attacked. Not all of them did, for example the imp Kanye was taking up more of a supporting role, but most were vicious in their attacks. They had the intent to kill, and their attacks showed it. They targeted specifically the workers, who they had divided across the inn by calling them on various errands. Whether it was through wood or stone, through claws or fangs, divinity or damnation, they attacked with all they had, intending to spare not a single one. The coordination was perfect, and many workers were unable to retaliate and were taken by surprise. Although most of them managed to defend, or evade the attacks entirely, they were too caught up dealing with the sudden change to do much other than barely survive. That was the plan all along. The first blow was devastating, and that was only just the beginning. The trees would grow larger, and give birth to a terrifying formation that had destroyed countless nations before this. The corpses of their enemies would become the fuel for the tree of heaven's might, and the Midnight Inn would be a name forgotten to history. The first 5 seconds passed, and the opening gambit was made, but the tree had no intention of waiting for a response. During its planning phase it had admitted that the inn was the strongest foe it had ever faced, and it could not give them time to respond at all. They had to be crushed in one go, leaving them unable to retaliate at all. So as the first few seconds passed, and many came to realize what was happening, darts of poisonous thorns shot out of all the vines, targeting the strongest workers and guests. The poison was the strongest, most lethal necrotic poison the tree could conjure, and could kill other nascent cultivators in less than a second. This attack alone would kill most living beings in the inn, leaving behind only the strongest and most resilient. The tree of heaven paid with the currency of its will, and so its will shall be done. Chapter 1087 The Unholy Queen. Anita was not having the best day. This day her pregnancy was particularly difficult, causing her to feel all sorts of muscle spasms and cramps in her undead body, not to mention the bouts of nausea that were suddenly coming. This was common, since she was not getting close. Only a little over 4 more decades and she'd give birth, meaning she was in the final stage of her pregnancy, so it was to be expected. Even so, she did not give up her duties as a mother, and through great effort and resilience, put her other baby to sleep. Finally, she could get some rest. Then the ground exploded beneath her, and she froze in fear and shock. Her eyes locked onto her baby's crib, now destroyed, and she saw the most devastating sight a mother could see. Her baby, who had just gone to sleep, had woken back up. She was in denial. She refused to accept what she was seeing, and for a few seconds, as carnage erupted all around them, her baby stared back at her. Then 5 seconds passed, and the baby started to cry. Gawain, being a dutiful father, immediately appeared and took the baby. "I've got this, Anita, it's okay. It's okay, I'll put him back to sleep. There's no reason to be upset. In fact, don't the explosions remind you of our honeymoon when dash?" He did not get to finish, because Anita grabbed her hair, pulled, and screamed. That was when the ever-bright sky of the Midnight Night realm, across the entire realm, turned black. "Mary, is the inn okay?" Lex asked, all the way on the other continent as a premonition struck him, but he did not need a reply because the shriek of an exhausted Anita roared across the entire realm. Quest time limit, 1 hour. Reward, keeping the damn realm is the reward. Quest failure punishment, the system is incredibly fragile at the moment. The destruction of the realm will result in the destruction of the system. By the time Lex read the notifications, an ear-piercing wail shot out from the mass of wood. Anita's flames burned souls, but did not harm them. How could she bear to do that? As a lich, she had many uses for the souls of her enemies, so it would be best if she got them whole and undamaged. The wood did not burn, but Anita squeezed it into itself, so that it went from a giant mass into a more easily handled container. She was using the tree's own body to imprison its soul as she punished it. Lex looked at Anita, then the state of the inn, and then at his quest. He had an entire hour, so it was best not to disturb Anita prematurely. "Honey, don't forget about its underlings," Gawain reminded her, and suddenly her gaze turned from the mass of wood down to the inn, where the guests who had attacked all the inn workers stood frozen in abject fear. It would have been easier for them to accept that their world was on the verge of destruction than to believe their tree was so effortlessly thwarted, and yet, both of those things were happening before their eyes, though they only knew of one. Green arrows formed once again, this time pointing at the ground. All the attackers finally remembered to run, but their efforts were for naught. Countless undead had appeared all around them, and held them down where they stood. Even the undead knew not to steal from their unholy queen. "You will all pay," she said once more, and let the rain of green, flaming arrows fall. Chapter 1088 Faux Pas. The entire attack lasted less than 10 seconds. The Tree of Heaven had been planning this assault for weeks, and prepared thoroughly for it. The mass of wood that Anita pulled out from the ground weighed hundreds of tons, and was more than strong enough to destroy entire nations. In fact, it had actually destroyed countless nations over the course of its many years with much fewer preparations. It couldn't be helped, since the Midnight Inn had countless members who were at the nascent realm, or at least pretended to be. But it did not believe they were as strong as they were portraying. Even among nascent soul cultivators, there were levels, and the tree had never found an equal in its entire age. It was unparalleled. It was the master of heaven and earth. It was the savior and executioner of races. For his arrogance, the Innkeeper would pay. It was with that mindset it began to make extensive preparations, even going as far as tolerating disrespect and biding its time. Everything was set. The accursed residents of the inn were to meet their fate. The tree had willed it so. So then, why was everything going wrong? The Tree of Heaven was the first living being, the most ancient, the most powerful. So then why was the two-legged she-abomination so easily able to yank out its entire clone body, and play with it like a toy? Did she not know her blasphemy by acting against it? It was her duty to lower her gaze and revel in the knowledge that the tree had decided to kill it. The tree's thoughts stopped there, for when Anita's soul flames tortured him it had no energy to spare for any more thoughts. Instantly it wanted to sever the connection it had to this clone, for the pain of the soul could be felt by its entire being. Yet it was all for naught, as it had lost all control over its clone, including the piece of its soul inside of it. For the first time in its existence, the Tree of Heaven knew true, unyielding pain. While its clone was twisted and squeezed into a ball, completely outside the control of itself, its real body was free to writhe in agony, and it did. Lady Anita, the Midnight Realm is a newborn realm. It cannot take your power. Please retract it, and keep it contained within the bounds of the Midnight Inn. Anita blushed, and suddenly withdrew her powers. The darkness withdrew from the realm, and Lex received the familiar ting of a notification informing him he had completed his quest. "Excuse me, I might have lost control for a bit," she said as she covered her face with her hands. She had committed a faux pas. "It's okay, no harm done," Lex said, then turned his gaze towards the ball of wood in her hands. "If you're able, can you also question all your prisoners about who was involved in this attack? I'll take some time to examine the inn, but once that's done, I should really go and see to it that everyone who escaped your just retribution is unable to escape punishment." Anita, who was blushing one moment, suddenly remembered what caused this whole incident, and her gaze turned cold. "I'll have a whole list ready. In fact, do you mind if I come with you? The seriousness of this travesty cannot go unanswered. I must deal with them personally." Lex raised an eyebrow, and then looked back at the inn. He wasn't sure if she was talking about the damage to the inn anymore. He'd never seen her get so riled up over an attack on the inn. But, whatever the case, her timely intervention had prevented more damage, so he wasn't going to complain. "Sure, you can come. In fact, I'll bring a few others as well. But just remember to keep your powers in check. This is still just a new realm. It cannot sustain your power yet." Chapter 1089 Setting Out. The damage from the attack was extensive, but fortunately there were no casualties, which was nearly a miracle. Nearly, because all the old guests of the inn, whether young or old, strong or weak, had undergone various power-ups and evolutions upon coming to the inn. Even the kids had become much more powerful, and though they may have not started to cultivate on their own yet, their bodies might as well be that of a cultivator. But while there were no casualties, many had been injured. The lack of recovery pods made the situation a lot more critical, and Dr. Charles Best was doing his best to ensure that the situation did not deteriorate further. The fairies who had just recently joined the Inn proved their worth at this time, using their fairy dust to heal all the wounded, or at least keep them from getting worse. At the same time, many of them could not help but look up at the beautiful lich who was torturing the souls of her enemies up in the air. They recalled what Lex had said about everyone needing to behave while at the inn. They suddenly did not doubt him anymore. Everyone had to behave, or else who knows what that lady would do. Once Lex was done talking to Anita, the first thing he did was come back down, take a single drop of blood, mix it with a lot of water, and then use it to treat all the wounded. He could easily do 1 drop per person, but even if he diluted his blood, the effectiveness of it was good enough. Moreover, he felt a little strange going around dropping his blood on people. He really needed to come up with an alternative to that. Besides the people, many buildings were also damaged, and without the host attire, repairing them would have to be a manual job. Lex did not anticipate too much trouble, considering that they were all cultivators and had techniques that could aid in reconstruction. But it was safe to say that it was going to be a hassle keeping all the guests who were already fed up of being at the inn placated now. For the most part, the guests just treated this incident as an entertaining interlude in their stay at the inn. At most, they were just interested to see how the locals would react after this incident was fully over. But some of them found it interesting that such an attack happened in the first place. Although Anita had very easily disposed of its clone, Lex expected the real body to put up a bigger fight. Even though it was limited to the nascent realm, it had absorbed countless pieces of resin, and so Lex would not be surprised if it could fight above its level. That was adding upon the fact that it was likely a mythical being. It was a very unique. Lex froze. The Tree of Heaven was a mythical being which had absorbed not one, but countless pieces of resin. He wondered if the corpse of the tree could count as an ingredient to fix the system. If it did, would it be the same as the resin, or would it count as a different one? This invasion could not have come at a better time. Ordinarily, Lex would not do something like killing a mythical being just to use it as a corpse. But since he was about to make an example of one anyway. Worry not, Lady Anita. I will make sure that the Tree of Heavens feels the full force of your wrath. Even a shred of its corpse will not be left behind. Lex spread his energy and encompassed the battalion, as well as everyone else who was coming along, and teleported them out. It might be difficult to find other things on this continent, but the tree was visible from nearly everywhere. Its size was genuinely astronomical, and even if Anita overpowered it, Lex did not think it would be so easy even for her to take it down. Heck, if Lex started burning it down, it would probably take months of continuous burning for the fire to spread across its entire body, let alone actually burning through it. Lex might as well be facing off against a small moon. But he was not worried, because he had prepared something special just for it. Chapter 1090 Burn Everything. Lex teleported only a few times before he came close enough that he could estimate the location of the massive tree that he could see even from a distance. But, before teleporting over to it directly, Lex turned around and addressed the battalion. For most of you, this is the first time you're heading out to fight. This is also the first time you'll be striking any enemy in revenge, so I should make clear how exactly we will do this. The Tree of Heaven will be much more powerful than any of you, so you will not be fighting the tree. Instead, that will be my job. You all, instead, will be attacking the direct subordinates of the tree and its most faithful zealous followers, the treants. But we are not here to commit genocide, so we won't be ripping every single tree from the ground. Civilians are not to be targeted. Instead, we will be targeting all the commanders, military personnel and zealots. Of course, if someone attacks you first, then feel free to retaliate. Basically, we're going after everyone responsible or complicit in the attack on the inn. Everyone nodded, and mentally prepared themselves for the battle ahead. All of the battalion members were naturally wearing their suits from the tailor's shop, so honestly speaking Lex did not expect them to take on any injuries at all. After all, their suits served as better armor than most actual armors. Lex spread his spirit sense to cover everyone, fixed his gaze on the tree of heaven, then teleported over. Just 20 minutes after the attack in the inn, they were retaliating. Even if the tree expected a response, it was unlikely that it was expecting it to be so quick. Most importantly, a part of the tree's soul was still being tortured by Anita, and it was clearly still not taking it well, as was evident by the tremors rocking the entire continent. Chances were, their attack on the tree would affect all of Manara, but Lex would try to make this as quick as possible. The moment they reappeared, Lex directly attacked the trunk of the tree. With a sword in hand, Lex used a new move from the Inferno Blade series, Waking Dream. Cassandra had clearly told him he needed to master this technique before he became an immortal or it would limit him. Lex had spent a long time pondering over why his increased comprehension wasn't allowing him to learn these last 3 moves. The conclusion he came to was that his mind was too rigid, and his conception of what was and wasn't possible was too well defined because of his life as a mortal on Earth. As a result, he would not think flexibly. But over the past few months, as a result of being exposed to the sealed domain, the shadow plane, and so many other things that defied common sense and his basic understanding of reality, he had finally become flexible enough to accommodate some principles that at first eluded him. Inferno Blade, Waking Dream was a strike that used the heat of vengeance to burn the souls of its targets. The moment he saw Anita burning the tree, Lex had an epiphany, and he could suddenly understand how something esoteric and intangible like emotions could have real and tangible temperature. This attack was already targeting the soul to begin with, and Lex further empowered it by entering his soul state, so the sword passed through the tree's physical body and cut right into its soul. He had one more thing prepared to take it down quickly. Lex blinked to the tree's body, and used a glyph. A massive, deep scarlet glyph appeared in front of Lex's face, radiating lethal danger. The tree of heaven, despite the mind-crippling pain it was in from having its soul constantly severed, suddenly snapped its attention to Lex as it for the second time that day encountered a sensation it had never felt before. It felt the threat of death closing in, on the verge of clasping its cold hands around it. Without thought or hesitation, the tree unleashed all its power at once. A tsunami of divinity erupted from its body, encasing its massive trunk in a radiant beam. Its roots, which had long become one with the continent, buried deep into the very core of the realm, suddenly erupted from the ground, and then were pulled back in at supersonic sounds. Its leaves became razors that could cut through the fabric of reality, uncaring for what barrier stood in their way. A billion treants across the land suddenly withered and died as all of their energy was suddenly absorbed by the Tree of Life, activating an ancient ability it had never needed to use. An illusory shield made of the densest bark formed around the tree, radiating an aura that subtly transcended the nascent realm. The true might of this ability could not be displayed in the fledgling nascent realm, but even this was enough to block out any conceivable attack a nascent-level enemy could throw at it. The size of the tree began to shrink as it used all its abilities in a split second. Beyond just the shield of bark, it used countless abilities both to attack and defend, not to mention it even used an incredibly desperate ability that would let it retain a hint of life even against overbearing odds. All this happened in a split second, and if it was afforded more time, no doubt the tree would unveil the true extent of its massive repertoire it had accumulated in its long life. But more time it did not have, because Lex used the glyph that represented a dragon's strongest attack, Dragon Breath. A jet of crimson and orange flames shot out of the glyph in front of Lex's mouth, sparing nothing that dared obstruct its path, accompanied by an earth-shattering dragon's roar. The Midnight Realm, which was still setting its foundation, and was still setting the laws that would govern the realm over the course of its existence, experienced a subtle change. A hint of the dragon's aura that was released alongside the flames was absorbed directly by the realm itself, and the laws it was forming underwent a minor change. But neither Lex nor anyone else noticed, for the devastation of the flames far surpassed anything Lex could have imagined. He had remained in the soul state, since he wanted the flames to attack the tree's soul and not its body. But a dragon's flames could not be suppressed. They burned everything,